Welcome to VOA 365's special program about how the US presidential election could impact Israel's rapidly improving relations with the Arab world. I'm Michael Lipin. For the first time since 1994, Israel has expanded its Arab ties, reaching deals with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan in the past few months with US help. What could happen to this process depending on the outcome of the presidential race and the reaction of Iran, Israel's main regional foe? For insight, I'm joined here in Washington by Shoshana Byren. She's the Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center, and from Israel by retired General Michael Herzog, an International Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Michael, let's start with you. What are the expectations in Israel about how a re-election of President Donald Trump would affect the normalization process with Arab states?
The breakthrough towards normalization between Israel and Arab states is definitely a historic development, a tectonic shift that nobody can ignore. And the expectation in Israel is that, notwithstanding the outcome of the elections, that trend will continue, that trend will develop. Because nobody, as I said, can ignore it, and it ultimately benefits the region, benefits the United States. However, there may be differences of policy between the two administrations. If Trump is reelected, I assume that the United States will continue to push very hard to expand this normalization and get more countries in the region on board. And while I expect that the Biden administration will also encourage this trend, I'm not sure to what extent it will push as hard towards that end. And we also see a potential difference is in the way each of these alternative administrations would relate normalization to the Israeli-Palestinian context. Here, I think if a Biden administration is elected, they will probably make a bigger focus, bigger effort on using Israeli-Arab normalization to also build bridges to the Israeli-Palestinian context, open space, and try and translate it also there.
Shoshana, what is your view of how a Biden administration or another Trump administration would shepherd this process?
How you think it's going to go depends on why you think it's here. If you believe that President Trump was pushing people sort of in a vacuum, you can assume that the Biden administration will push them less. But if you understand that this is a long process where conversations between Israel and its Arab neighbors, or Israel and Sudan, started long ago, you see it in the context of the Obama administration's push toward Iran. They were negotiating with Iran, they were paying Iran, they were making deals with Iran, and all of that made the Gulf states and a lot of the North African countries nervous. Where do you go when you're nervous? You look for stability. Israel, in this sense, sees the region the same way the Gulf states do. Iran is the focus of the problems. That's not going to change. That's not going to change. It's called enlightened self-interest. You found a partner, the Gulf states found a partner that sees the threat in the region as Iran. Israel is a partner in confronting Iran. If that's the case, if that's where it comes from, the Biden administration will have less to do with it than the self-interest of the parties.
Well, Michael, I wanted to also follow up on a point that you made earlier. You think that there could be less of an emphasis by a Biden administration on pushing for additional normalization deals. Why do you think that is? I mean, Joe Biden, the former vice president, has said he is concerned about how normalizations could affect the Palestinians who have been left out of the process so far.
Well, I did not suggest that the Biden administration will not push in that direction. What I said is I'm not sure how hard they will push. Let me give you one example. We just saw a breakthrough towards normalization with Sudan. This is a complex issue with a lot of moving parts. And the Sudanese, as far as we know, wanted to delink their delisting from the state sponsors of terror from normalization with Israel. And it took very strong urging, cajoling by the Trump administration to get them to agree to normalization. It's not that easy a process, and it's still, they are not going all the way like the UAE. They are doing it very gradually. So I think you do need a push from DC. I agree with Shoshana that there is enlightened self-interest here, and we've been, below the radar, developing our relations with our neighbors for years now. And the fact that this region just experienced a decade of wars, turmoil, failing and failed states, socioeconomic crisis, and all that pushed some of our neighbors towards us because they realize that Israel is here, it's effective. Also, our pushback against Iran, I think, played a role here. So that will continue. But how strong a push from DC, that depends.
Now, I would agree with Michael. Sudan's interests are a little bit different than, let's say, Bahrain's interest or even Saudi interest. They have their own internal calculation. They wanted to be delisted from the terror sponsor list. They want relations with the United States. Their whole push was something else. And it was the Trump administration that created the quid pro quo, that created the need to create relations with Israel. But Sudan's a little different. Other North African states will be a little bit different as well. If you look at the future of Morocco or Tunisia or whatever, but the Gulf states and Sudan had different internal requirements.
Well, Shoshana, what makes you think that some of the other North African states, for example, might have different calculations than Sudan when it comes to establishing ties with Israel?
Sudan is a funny government. It overthrew its leadership a year ago. It's a transitional government between the military and the civilian people. They threw out the Islamist government. So theirs is really about figuring out how to create a stable state for the future. If you look at countries like Tunisia or Morocco, or even Algeria, they are not considering changing governments. They are not looking at overthrow. They have a different set of interests, and Morocco and Israel have ties of a certain sort already. Tunisia has not unfriendly thoughts about the state of Israel, but they all operate on the basis of their own self-interest. And Michael's right again, a lot of this has to do with the chaos that consumed the region for the last 10 years. And I would, if there's time, relate it to the Arab Spring. I mean, we are really looking at the long-term results of what we in the West call the Arab Spring and countries in the region called the disaster.
Well, Michael, what do Israelis anticipate when it comes to other, North African states, considering having relations with Israel?
Well, the first candidate in North Africa mentioned is Morocco. I think Algeria, Tunisia, we still have a way to go. We do have ties with Morocco, unofficial ties for a long time. We have Israel had a lot of dealings with Morocco. However, as Shoshana mentioned, each country has its own calculations. Morocco is concerned about recognition of its hold over Western Sahara, and if that is settled, I think there's potential there that they will also join.
Shoshana, what about other states in the Gulf? When you look at those that have not yet established peace with Israel, which do you think are likely to do so in the coming months, and which do you think may take a lot longer?
Well, Qatar, I think, is never going to be there. It is an arm of Iran. It's an arm of Iran in many ways. It spends Iranian money on things that are designed to aggravate Israel or to kill Israelis. I mean, they are really a state whose foreign policy in the region is inimical to the interests of Israel. You have Oman, maybe, why not? You have Saudi Arabia. If you read all of the interview with Prince Bandar a couple of weeks ago, Prince Bandar bin Sultan talked about what he sees as Saudi interests. And Saudi interests, in his case, were to unwind from the Palestinians. It was not at all about establishing relations with Israel. As I see it, many people are saying Saudis next, Saudis next. I'm not sure that's true. I think the Saudis internally have a lot of reasons to approve of this, to allow Israeli overflights over their country, to not get in the way of anything. But it's a huge step for them to open relations. I think they may come later down the pike.
Michael, how about you? What do you think of the prospects that Saudi Arabia, which is the dominant country in the Gulf, what are the prospects that they would establish ties with Israel?
I think ultimately it will happen, but not soon. It'll take time. I think it's a long process. Saudi Arabia is a big prize, custodian of holy Muslim shrines. It is a very significant actor in the Middle East, but they have their own calculations. They've always been the custodians of the Arab Peace Initiative and so on. And they're also concerned about some pushbacks against them, so it'll take time. Analysts assume that as long as King Salman is there, Saudi Arabia will stick by the traditional position, namely no breakthrough until there's breakthrough between Israelis and Palestinians. But generally speaking, I believe Saudi Arabia is already moving in that direction very incrementally. Shoshana mentioned allowing Israeli overflights. They, by and large, welcomed normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan. We hear some different undertones coming out of Saudi Arabia as regards relations with Israel, as regards relations with Jews. So I think all of it indicates that ultimately Saudi Arabia will also come around, but not very soon.
Well, Shoshana, as you know, there already are flights between Israel and the UAE. That's one of the first fruits of the normalization deal. And Bahrain and Israel also have established air links, direct air links. In what areas do you think Israel's relationships with these two Gulf Arab states are going to move forward most quickly?
Again, look at who has an interest in what. The Gulf states have young, rather well-educated populations. Those are people who want the benefits of the West. They want the technology. Technology is huge. Israel is a technology incubator. So there's room for trade. There's room for technology cooperation. There's a conversation, apparently, and we don't know a lot about it, between Israel and the UAE about an oil pipeline that would go, instead of going south through the Red Sea and out to the bottom, would go up the Red Sea and across Israel, putting oil out in the Mediterranean. Those are the kinds of things that make sense from the UAE point of view and the Bahraini point of view. So I suspect, again, look for self-interest. By the way, on the question of who's coming next, there was a very bizarre report out of Iraq pushing for conversation with Israel. Why are they doing it? It's, again, self-interest. They have a problem, many Iraqis have a problem with the role that Iran plays in their government, in their commerce, and in their lives. And to wave the flag of Israel and say, oh, well, we're going to go and talk to Israel, this is something that Iraqis can point to and say, this is really anti-Iranian. So I don't think it's coming. I don't think we're going to have relations between Israel and Iraq. But it's interesting that the concept has become a concept that countries use to further their own interests.
Well, Michael, have you heard anything in Israel about Iraqis contemplating relations with Israel?
Not really. I mean, not in concrete terms. There's talk in Iraq, some people expressing interest. We even heard the daughter of the president of Lebanon saying she would be interested in visiting Jerusalem if we resolved our outstanding territorial issues and so on. So there's more talk in the region about that, but this does not translate yet into concrete steps. But I would like to relate to your questions about the potential of Israeli-Arab normalization, given the agreements with the UAE and Bahrain. I think with the UAE, the sky's the limit, because we have two dynamic societies, two dynamic countries, two of the very few functioning states in the Middle East. And we have a lot of common interests, and we can do a lot together. This is going to be a warm peace, not a cold peace like the ones we have with Egypt and Jordan. Peace between peoples, not only governments. And as I said, the sky's the limit. I would like to highlight what Shoshana said about the potential cooperation in the field of energy. This is happening. We are going to conclude an agreement whereby UAE oil will be exported to Israel and through Israel to Europe. The Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline changed its name to the Europe-Asia pipeline, and this is going to it's going to be a very huge development.
Well, Shoshana, I wanted to also ask you about another side effect of the Israeli normalization with the UAE and Bahrain. Both of those Gulf Arab states have a lot of expatriates, including Arabs from many countries that don't have relations with Israel. And with more and more Israelis going to those two Gulf states and mixing with Arabs from those countries that don't recognize the Jewish state, what potential do you think there is for people-to-people exchanges that could push that process forward?
The more times you have people in the same place, the more the process moves forward. But I think it's a better question actually for Michael, because the question really is, how do Israelis relate to Arabs in the region, not just people of the UAE or of Egypt or of Jordan, but that's really a question I think for Michael.
And Michael, what do you think? Is that something that Israelis have already started talking about, having interactions in these two Gulf states with Arabs from all over the region?
Yes, actually it's happening. But Israelis are very excited, are very enthusiastic about these new openings. Israelis are now rushing to the UAE and Bahrain, and they would like to expand their network of relations across the region. This is something Israeli society has been thriving for. And I think that you will see more of it. You will see, even with countries with whom we don't have diplomatic relations, you already see it on social media. I think you'll see more and more of it. The ice is breaking in the region, and it's happening.
Well, Shoshana, I'd also like to look at how this normalization process is affecting Iran. Now, some people are talking about how Iran is becoming more isolated in the region, with more of its Arab neighbors establishing ties with Israel, which Iran obviously does not recognize. How do you think this isolation manifests itself?
Look, Iran is isolated because Iran is the odd man out in the region, not because Bahrain woke up one morning or UAE woke up one morning and established relations with Israel. Relations between Iran and the Gulf states were already very poor. So it's not as if they turned their back on Iran and turned to Israel. It's a growing realization that Iran is a menace. They look at Syria. They look at the destruction, massive destruction by the government of Iran in Syria, mostly against Sunnis, since Syria is a majority Sunni country. They look at Iran as a problem. The nuclear deal is a problem for them. Iranian aggression in the Persian Gulf is a problem for them. So the normalization only makes formal the fact that Iran has been isolated for a long time. Iran has a lot of money. Some of that is thanks to the United States. And now the arms embargo, it appears, will be collapsing because the Europeans favor trade with Iran over preventing Iran from finishing its nuclear project. The equities haven't changed. The same countries don't like Iran now as didn't like Iran before. Iran is isolated, moreover, because it's running out of money. And it hasn't had time yet to make a deal with China for whatever it is that China will give them. If I were the Iranians, I wouldn't get into bed with China because the Chinese end up owning all your assets. But that's their call. They are isolated because they're poorer, because they had a bad response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and because they have been aggressors in the region and no one likes them.
Well, Michael, obviously Iran is not happy about even the perception of seeming isolated, but what it has done so far is mainly issue statements denouncing these normalization agreements. Why do you think what we've seen publicly from Iran up to now has just been rhetoric?
The truth is that Iran doesn't have many options. I think Iran is under very, very heavy pressure, economic pressure, domestic pressure. There's a regional pushback against Iran. I don't think they have an interest in escalating things to military confrontation either with the United States or Israel. I believe they're also very careful ahead of the US elections. They would like to see who gets elected before they make any crucial move here. So the range of options is limited. What I would expect, however, is notwithstanding the results of the US elections, they're probably going to try and do some subversion in the Gulf, especially in Bahrain, where the majority are Shiites, and Iran is known to have acted there in subversive manners. But I don't think that they will cross a certain line that could lead to escalation, and they don't have many options in the region. They are isolated to an extent.
Well, Shoshana, what do you think Iran could do, in practice to try to slow this process down?
I don't know if they can slow the process, but I think Michael's right that Bahrain is a target of Iran in many ways. And if I were a Bahraini, I would have to take that very seriously. Beyond that, they're working very hard with the limited resources that they have to create a military establishment inside of Syria, missile factories, support for Hezbollah, support for things that could hurt Israel from the north as opposed to from the southeast where they live. Those sorts of things Iran will continue to do, and I assume Israel will continue to meet those problems. But what can they do to subvert it? I'm not sure they can. They don't have the money to bribe people. They're spending their money in certain ways having to do with their nuclear capability and their interests in Syria and Lebanon. Politically, they don't really have any power in the Gulf. The Gulf states will do what they think is best. But Bahrain, if I were Bahrain, I would worry.
Michael, do you think these Arab normalizations with Israel will affect in any way Iran's pursuit of its nuclear program?
No, I think their ambitions are there and they will continue to be there. And if at all, they may be enhanced by what they see in the region, because in their perception, in order to be able to project power and also to ensure their own longevity, the longevity of the regime, that they need nuclear power. That's the way they look at it. So they will continue to push for it. And whether or not they are successful depends on whether or not the international community and other actors in the region will move to stop them.
Well, Shoshana, just very quickly, because we're running out of time, when President Trump announced the Israeli-Sudan deal, he hoped that Iran would eventually join, a family of peace in the region and come on board. What do you think it would take for that to happen?
Am I allowed to say a change of government? This government has interests and goals, and they are not coming to the table. The president invited the Palestinians to come and take a part of this. He invited the Iranians to come and take a part of it. I agree with the president in principle. I don't see it happening.
Well, that is all the time we have for our program. My thanks to Shoshana Byren of the Jewish Policy Center here in Washington, and to Michael Herzog of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, speaking to us from Israel. I'm Michael Lipin. Thank you very much for watching VOA 365.
Thank you.
Thank you.